Ladies and gentlemen, the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina is in reality no state at all. It is in reality two states crammed together by the Dayton Accord in an ill-advised attempt to end a bitter conflict. It has succeeded only in ending that conflict, not in creating the kind of statehood that the people who decided to push for that accord wish to create. It is no closer now than it was in 1997 to getting free of international trusteeship. There are more UN peacekeepers on the ground right now in Bosnia than are on the ground in Kosovo. It is clear that this is a situation which is getting no better. It is a situation in which there is a massive democratic deficit for the Serbs living there, where they have to accept the rule of the Office of the High Representative. We think all of these reasons mean it is a state that cannot continue, and it is a state which the Republic of Srpska should leave and form its own independent state. The borders already exist as defined by the Dayton Accord. Those are the borders that we're going to use. We are, of course, going to allow people who do not wish to live in an independent Republic of Srpska to move across the border into Bosnia and Herzegovina if they want to. We are ambivalent on whether or not the Republic of Srpska wants to, at a later date, join the Republic of Serbia. They may wish to do that, they may not. We don't particularly care about that at the moment. And we're going to maintain the UN peacekeepers on the ground throughout that transition until it is safe for them to withdraw. We think that's going to be much more likely under our policy than it is in this aspect. What I'm going to do in this speech is first of all look at how it's impossible for the Serbs to be sovereign without their independence. Then I want to move on and take a look at the political discourse within Bosnia and Herzegovina, how that's completely distorted and in fact no politics at all. And then I want to move on and take a look at life on the ground for these people and how that would be improved if they decided to be independent. So firstly, how it's impossible to be sovereign without independence. Recognise right now that there is a massive democratic deficit for the individual groups that exist within Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is true of the Croats, of the Bosniaks, and of the Serbs, right? But just in terms of the Serbs' reasoning, they need only recognise that they themselves cannot be sovereign. How does it operate? Well, the Office of the High Representative, which is the international trustee, basically like the global policeman, which the Dayton Accord put in place there, is an office which is not accountable to the people of that country. It is an office which can effectively do whatever it likes and railroad through whatever policies it likes and alter whatever governments exist within that country, right? Clearly there's a massive democratic deficit, which means that those people cannot be sovereign in deciding how their country is run at the highest level, right? They only have control, no thanks, over their own little region as long as it doesn't interfere with anything the Office of the High Representative thinks should be happening within Bosnia and Herzegovina as a greater nation state. So that's particularly problematic. And it effectively means that a technocrat has the ultimate rule over their country. The rotating presidency that goes through the three groups also means that in effect, for 6 months every 18 months, they do get some kind of control over their own country. But in fact, what actually happens is that for the other 12 months of those 18 months, the presidency is given to a different grouping that doesn't represent their wishes, that doesn't represent their wants, because the political discourse is so skewed in Bosnia to be only around your racial identity and not around anything else. So there is no incentive the other presidency to do anything to help the Republic of Srpska whatsoever, and to help the Serbs living within that area whatsoever. So they only have effective government on a pan-state level and on an international level every 6 months and every 18 months. So that's particularly important in recognising it's impossible for them to be sovereign today. The other way, though, which is the political discourse which we're on right now, also makes it impossible for them to really truly be sovereign, to have proper politics. How does that operate? Well, the politics within all factions in Bosnia is uniquely negative in that it's a forced reaction to the other groups that exist nearby. So what that means is that the Serbian problems in Bosnia are the fault of the Bosniaks and the fault of the Croats in their political discourse. That means that no actual discourse builds up around what individual leaders are doing. No discourse builds up around what direction those people should be taking and what way their nation should be forming, what way they can best protect their identity, what way they can best protect their people, right? Because they vote effectively in mono-ethnic blocks, which is why we see in every election bar one mono-ethnic parties being elected in all three of the areas that exist within Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? So, and it means as well that the politicians seem weak if they want to cross barriers and deal with what are effectively their enemies, right? So that means that the other politicians that aren't Serbs, but aren't in any way going to serve the Republic of Srpska, so that's particularly problematic whenever they have any sort of control of any sort of power. It also means that you're not going to get any sort of an alleviation of this at any point in the future, because it is so monoethnic and because it is so ghettoized in a way that means there is no understanding across the cultural barriers. The existence of the Office of the High Representative means that politicians, if they don't blame other ethnicities, can simply blame that office for the people's problems, which means that they're not in any way accountable. There is no political discourse that exists there. In essence, those people can never actually be sovereign. The monoethnic parties also lead to massive blocks in terms of government forming. And you only look at the 2010 election and the 15 months it took for a government to form in Bosnia after that. Clearly these people are not being served by the state that they're living in. Go ahead.
Do you think that the peace that has been created is a valuable to preserve, and that it can be preserved when you don't have any sort of protections for either side?
The peace that has been created is very valuable. However, the data courts have already run their course. They have created the peace that they needed to create. That's what I want to talk about now in my third point, which is about life for these people, right? Recognize that extreme ghettoization exists within that nation at the moment, which makes it that, in fact, outside of individual people living within the Republic of Serbia, there is no benefit to being part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because they can't really move elsewhere and get jobs because of the kind of racism and ethnic tension that they face everywhere else within the country. There is still recognized flashpoint violence very often around Bosnia. That's why there are so many peacekeepers still on the ground there. The flashpoint violence happens around the opening of things like mosques and churches and graveyards and all those sorts of stuff. Why does that get much better under our proposition now? It gets much better when there is a defined international border in which those people have their own space, which is definitely theirs. No thanks, you're out of time. And in which case, the people who choose to live in the Republic of Serbia are those who have chosen to live in a place which they know is governed uniquely by the majority in that area. So you're much less likely, therefore, to get them kicking back against the building of churches in that area, because they now see that area and they know that to be definitively the property of those people. So they can't continue that violence and they can't continue to fight. The presence of international borders also means it's much better to effectively police them anyway, because you can get UN peacekeepers to get the border patrols and make the violence better. So we alleviate the flashpoint violence which still exists and we give them back their sovereignty. So I'm going to think about this.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What do we hear here on the first part? Peace has been created, now we can let it go. What do we hear? That the only purpose of the Dayton Peace Accord and the situation at the moment is to preserve peace. What we're going to talk about now is that it's not. It's about reconciliation, it's about bridging gaps in history, it's about bringing these communities together inside and outside of that state. I'm going to talk about 2 points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why we're seeing this happening on the ground now, in spite of what we're actually hearing coming out of the first proposition, and why we see this having long-term potential. And secondly, I'm going to talk about all the benefits that come about from the long-term preservation of the state in its current existence. And in that, I'm going to talk about the problems with basing your politics specifically on ethnically homogenous states, and the problems that we've seen that historically, and why we don't see that as a solution to a problem that is based around the level of interaction between ethnicities not being consistent enough, right? Some rebuttal first, in terms of their conceptions of the problems within politics within Bosnia and Herzegovina. So firstly, to talk about the problem of the High Representative, right? There's 2 points. Firstly, the High Representative is not something that necessarily means that those people need to be separatists. It's a problem within the state itself. It's not linked to the whole idea of ethnic nationalism in any way. It's actually a point that is a rallying point between all of these communities, in that they want to assert further independence away from themselves. And it's one of the many things that is uniting these communities in the ground in terms of their political causes. Secondly, in terms of relations across cultural barriers being limited as they are now, and talking about the problems with that, and he wants to just exacerbate that problem by making those barriers actually official legal lines in terms of sovereignty, in terms of completing other sovereignty. Right? Thirdly, there's some point about the presidency and the functioning of the presidency. This is a complete mischaracterization of how this presidency is actually operating in terms of its rotation. It is not that a Serbian president gets in and refuses to do anything whatsoever to benefit any Bosnian and will only allow anti-Bosnian legislation to pass through. By and large, that president's power is vetoing bills that come out of the government, so it tends to only veto bills that it sees as threatening to minority communities within the different enclaves, and tends to be blocked between those communities. I think it's a complete mischaracterization to say that just because the presidency rotates, that when certain ethnic groups in power, that it's necessary that was the other one. We just told them they veto politics that they see as an invested community, they do not attack other communities, they use that position as an ability to defend themselves politically in any way that they need to, and I think that's a hugely valuable thing rather than a problem in terms of the labor system, right? So, moving on to my first point of substantive, right? So, what is the situation on the right? So firstly, we don't think that you can claim that a relatively new state has already failed. I think that's a big assertion to make. I think it's very dangerous to say that this is already like a doomed project because we haven't seen levels of cooperation yet, right? So firstly, we think we are already getting a level of these people being allowed themselves into two distinct parliaments that exist in this country. So people do feel that they have a sense of political representation, right? So I think there is a very positive sense in that, in terms of people feeling that they have that power, right? But in addition to that, we are also seeing levels of cooperation occurring between the two communities. Our second point will be about why it's important and beneficial in the long run, but let me tell you the kind of stuff that we're seeing happening now. Because what we're seeing now is, say, like, agricultural workers from both groups of societies, like the cultural rights, are coming together to lobby for changes in terms of policy and lobby for like movement into the EU and like changing relations in the EU so that they will guarantee their own interests. We see these people coming together and we see this already happening across cultural barriers, which necessarily lessens the tensions between those cultural barriers. Something that we see in as much as all the conflict that they talk about and the pieces we made, and even if the is still concerned, which is Mark has to say, well, the President of UN peacekeepers is necessarily meaning that there's some sort of violence going to break out the moment that they leave, it's a bit of an exaggeration, it's just an exaggeration. In terms of that, like, dealing with it, what's the mechanism behind this? So we say that the interested people on the ground are not entirely like ethnic. Like we don't think there was such a thing as only Serbian interest or only Bosnian interest or only pro-interests. Like these people have interests that are environmental political or environmental economic and are cooperating with cross groups to try and achieve those framework they have. Thank you. We think that necessarily is the situation. That is not that's what the political pressure. Trying to change like the way these environments cooperate and brings them more likely to have a sense of cooperation across these politics, breaking down all of this what Mark told you the problems with ethnic and homogenous politics and bringing them to a situation where there are better relations across communities, not only because those relations are facilitated, but also because the perceptions are different. Before I move on to the second point, I think
Okay, so all of that is a concession that they are now getting on slightly better and makes it less likely that they will return to violence when they move apart.
Okay, I'm going to talk about why, just because they're not going to come back, just because we don't believe that like Somalis and violence doesn't mean that that's the only, like that in itself is a benefit. We think that in itself is the only reason to let Somali. We think there are huge other mechanisms when we talk about them, and entire set of other reasons that is not how we consider as to why this is hugely beneficial as a state. Okay. So what are we talking about? We've already said that this is not just about peace, this is about reconciliation. What do we mean by reconciliation? Changing perceptions of these groups in terms of how they relate with each other. I've told you in my last one why this is a mechanism. I'll tell you why it's hugely important in this case, right? All of the conflict that we have seen in this region is entirely based on ethnic lines. What they do on the front is they further entrench the idea that these ethnicities must necessarily be tied to state, that you can only exist within ethnically homogenous states. Right? I think there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, I think that the way that they talk about people only aligning to politics ethnically, we think that's something that's actually changing in colonialism themselves. I think that only exists because by and large these people have mainly, this is the first time many of these communities are living in stable states and they're all pretending their ethnicity for RadioMOF, whereas now they're existing in a political system where they can align themselves to that, right? And in terms of that as well, we don't think you can necessarily say that the visions are not clear. We think that there are levels of intermarriage, there are levels of mixing between those communities. What do you do to them? What do you do to people who form bonds across the state and you tear them apart? And what do you do to all of the functioning that is happening now, we told you about, across borders? Where do you leave that, right? What happens when you set up these ethnic states? Necessarily, in as much as you have minorities in these countries, there's always going to be some level of Bosnian play in a certain orders under a certain against Bosnian order. But when you say that that state is entirely based on that ethnicity, you leave those people in a situation where they can not allow themselves to that state whatsoever in any situation. I think that's a massive problem with ethnic states. We also think that's a larger conflict in terms of ethnic perceptions across different borders, changing across different countries, seeing changing attitudes in certain Bosnian communities in general, all across the Balkans, brings about a situation where reconciliation can happen in as much as these people are willing to leave themselves consume each other rather than just be forced to have and rather than see that they're not the only thing that they can depend on. Those points are moved across.
Ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen, the case that we heard so far from the first opposition is at best a severe misunderstanding of how things actually work for average people currently living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's simply not the case that everyone is living together happily, creating some sort of united statehood. The thing is that there are already borders which are recognised by individuals living within those countries. Everything that individuals do is still centralised around their ethnicity. Firstly, that is the case already. Secondly, if they're against that, the existence of Croatia and Serbia is something that suggests it can be about that. Those individuals define more in line with those individual countries, rather than by the accident of history that forced them to keep living together because the international community thought that would fix things. That's a misunderstanding, it's not the case. Before I move on to talk about community building and why that doesn't happen at the moment, why what they tell you just simply isn't the case, then about violence and peace, because they are happy to tell us that violence won't happen, they want to say that it will, so I guess I'll talk about both. And then why it's better for those individuals who are currently living in this half-state that denies them the things they deserve. 2 points of rebuttal beforehand. First, they tell us that it's not necessary that the High Representative will continue to exist if they chose to remain living within the current state. I mean, that simply would mean that only one party would be able to, based on one ethnicity, as voters smart tells you, vote along ethnic lines, would then have control of policy entirely within the country. We imagine that's what the international community realised when they installed a High Representative. Unfortunately, it simply just means outsourcing of blame and no one actually getting to enact the policies that might serve their people or acting as their people as a collective. Second, they tell us we misunderstand the president's role. It's not that they introduce only laws that are incredibly racist. Well, I mean, it's not that they're incredibly racist, it's that they have to be slightly more in favour of the people of their ethnicity when they're on a rotating presidency, because they expect that that will happen the next time other ethnic groups get that presidency. They feel that if they're acting fairly, the people within that group who continue to vote for them won't think that they're acting fairly, think that they're giving too many concessions, think that they're letting the other side have too much and not favouring them enough, and that simply means they're less likely to get elected again because it's more likely that extremist parties can succeed, as I'll talk about. Second, they say, well, I mean, it's only that they will veto bills, that's their primary responsibility. I mean, they will still veto the bills of the other ethnic groups instead that might offer favourable treatment to them or equal treatment as they deserve, because again, that's politically tenable, because that's expected when you're in that office. So community building first. They tell you can't have mono-ethnic states, that's a bad sign. There's absolutely no reason that there's anything wrong with Slovenia or Croatia at the moment, because individuals who are still centred around their ethnicity should have the entitlement to decide what that's represented by their state. That's a legitimate choice that the international community has absolutely no legitimacy in denying to them, because they think living together will fix it. Realise though, that everything that individuals within these nations do is not a process of integration and learning to come to a shared conception of their past. They have separate education systems. Not only does that mean that the children of the next generation are not growing up together and learning acceptance, they are segregated and continue to be told that their ethnicity should be a defining factor, that their nationality is after their ethnicity because they don't define as Bosnians, but they mostly define as being Serbian. So we don't think that that's good enough. Second, they have entirely separate media. There is in existence 3 different types of radio, television program, or television station and newspaper that are subscribed to by each different ethnicity because they don't believe that there is fairness that exists. They don't believe that the problems they have are the problems of everyone else within that state. They believe they're created by the other parties in that state. Their politics continue to be separate. The politician you're likely to vote for is one that will represent you based on your ethnicity, not based on your nationality. And that's tenable because people primarily have to still define around it. They're living in separate states, basically, but not recognised as such by the international community. We don't think that in-between is good enough because all it does is to deny them the ability to make decisions for their own country. Second.
Okay, so if your problem is that this might empower extremists, what do you tell extremists when they lose all potential claim to all of the land that they consider theirs in the
They're definable, there's borders already. There is no reason to suspect that will change, given that that's what's been the status quo for 10, 15 years, because that's what the international community suggests is best. So all they're told is that they will have borders, but not complete sovereignty. So we don't see why that's better. They tell you then that they lobby together for some sort of farming reform, and that's a significant sign of progress. That's a suggestion that might continue to happen when they're separate states if they realise that there are things that are in their best interest and that they can mutually benefit from. The thing is that is blocked currently because it is seen as being something you shouldn't agree on, because you are seen as caving and giving in too much should you cooperate. That's not true when you can decide your political party is not based on extremists, but based on the interests of all people within your nation and what suits those best, without feeling like it's concessions along the way. So violence and peace. Well, the initial violence, no thanks. The initial violence was simply because the international community recognised that you ought to land grab because we'll soon define your borders. The violence afterwards was simply an indication of the frustration within these nations that they can't self-govern. So we don't think that it's simply something that has to continue. Next, it can be a blame that they're blaming on politicians for not doing enough and saying they should take it into their own hands, or they blame the stagnancy that occurs, and there's no suggestion from them that anything will change except we hope they'll learn to be different. Why is it better for Serbians than in Bosnia? First, because they get sovereignty. I mean, usually we buy into the concept of nationhood because everyone actually believes that we're all in it together to a larger extent than we do just with everyone in the world. Well, that doesn't happen within your state, though. There's no reason to believe it has any meaning to you, when all it does is hold you back from being able to make freer decisions politically and freer decisions in the real world. It's not good enough. Politicians, at the moment, have to be more extreme because they have to keep fighting. They have to keep fighting against the other side. They have to keep justifying it, and they use the idea of different ethnicities to do so. They don't have to under our proposition because you don't have to fight against policies you believe to be acting against you. Because you can decide what is in collective best interest, which isn't something that happens at the moment. You get more blame and accountability because you no longer have an internationally appointed individual acting as a technocrat over you. It means if your politicians don't do as you request, they can't point the finger at the international community. You have to ask them why they didn't do it, given that they now have the capacity to do so. It also means you can criticise your politicians more because to do so is no longer anti-nationalistic. It means you can choose more legitimate parties that can fight for your best interests, as opposed to saying you have to go with the one that's more likely to do it for you. Why is that the case that it's always extremists? That's because moderates can be seen as making too many concessions. They can be seen as not being biased enough. They can be seen as weak, and these individuals are much likely to be able to justify reasonable policies when they know that they aren't making concessions to individuals within your state anymore that you wish didn't exist. Because these individuals live separately, because these individuals are only denied the ability to actually have a political system, to actually be recognised internationally, and to make their own lives better, we don't see why they should continue to live in this false state they don't believe in.
Ladies and gentlemen, first proposition's case is that these are essentially sovereign states. Essentially, this model is already enacted, we just have to do it in name. We say that they fail to recognise that problems such as genocide take time to fix. And while we recognise that there are problems on the ground at the moment and separatism on the ground at the moment, we think that in the long term, the economic state, the unity that will come from opposing this motion leads to a better outcome for all those people on the ground. We think that in terms of economics, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of the international recognition that comes with peace and reconciling with your neighbour is ultimately better. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about why the political process is not better when we separate these states. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why it's harmful to give the message that the Yugoslav wars are still going and keep on splitting up these countries. But first of all, a little note on this sovereignty thing that we get from first prop. I mean, first of all, if they're so sovereign, we question why they still have to depend on other countries to defend their right to exist in the way they have to do with the UN. But their whole idea of sovereignty is based on having the ability to protect themselves. But that probably comes into conflict. We say a more likely estimation of conflict is that both parties sign the Dayton Accord, so there is some democratic willpower and consensus in this. Second of all, we think that sometimes sovereignty isn't just having your own army and having your government like that. It's having recognition of your ethnicity while actually having peace on the ground. So we think that all those, the office of higher representation and all of the diminishment of power in that extent is simply to provide a greater benefit, that being peace, stability, some balance between potentially racist states. We think that that's necessarily more important for those people on the ground who are tired of war. Now, let's talk about the political process. Because we think this whole idea of nationalisation and ghettoisation and identity becoming synonymous with your ethnicity happens when we separate. We look at states like India and Pakistan, and we see that all of the problems that they identify and that happen in those countries, we got mass movements so that we had 20% of Indians living in Pakistan going down to less than 2%. We get that mass movement considering there is some element of integration as Cormac said in terms of intermarriage. And we suddenly get it being defined as the most important thing. We think that all this stuff about what Christine brings you, about, suddenly we can now criticise the politicians, now we can be seen to give concessions. That's not the case with Serbia and Croatia, these countries that just say they're so wonderful. Let's look at the fact that they cannot recognise Kosovo. teach your own language at school, that's probably not a big deal. However, when farmers on the ground realize that Croatia coming to the EU will probably backfire on you economically, they can both accept their ethnicity, accept what's accepted, and come together on that neutral ground, compromise on things like money, on things that aren't so filled with tension and hate and animosity, ladies and gentlemen. That gives some ground for reconciliation without having to separate. Because we think the problems we get from first cross, instead of tension, violence, I've already told you why those exist. We think in terms of the economy and border patrol and the fact that you're always going to have to interact with your neighbour, right? Like Bosnia, the Muslim Slovak Federation and the Republic of Srpska, they're always going to interact. We give more possibility for that happening when we say that it is possible to cooperate. You don't always have to separate when it is necessarily impossible for you to ever act together in the same way. We think in terms of international recognition, the EU is a really important actor. When we get separation, we think it's impossible for the EU to ever see these as rational beings that are able to overcome their differences. I think that's really important in terms of the way that all of these countries are now coming together to try to join members there. We think that in the long run, there's more chance of that happening if we say it's possible to remain part of a sovereign state. So we think that all the problems in terms of radicalisation, difficulty in political discourse happen on their side of the house, but we give some chance for political reconciliation by giving some neutral ground, because we think that ultimately people are tired of war, but they would like to earn some money, right? So they can talk about things they both care about while not having a language of the threat. I'll take those.
Okay. Like cohesion and working together is so important, then why have they been proportional autonomy now when they choose to separate themselves?
Okay, because for all the reasons that they said, there's no point in saying that ethnicity isn't somewhat important to Bosniaks and Serbs on the ground. There's no point in saying that they don't care about the language. Of course they do. So we think some elements of autonomy is good in recognising that. We think that complete autonomy means that they can never compromise, can never come to put together things that are completely separate like that, like the economy, like interaction with other states. Perhaps they do, gentlemen. We say that by giving some sort of balance to the situation, you can say that while you have the multifaceted identity, because you can be Bosniak and still talk to your Serb partner, that necessarily doesn't happen under their side of the house and makes the Serbian Republic a worse off place. We think that some element of balance allows both states to function, have things that are important to them, while having some ability to cooperate, to have less border tensions in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, why do we think it's really bad message to say that Yugoslav wars are still going, we're still splitting up? Because we have an element of peace. We have drawn a line under this conflict. When we say that we're still splitting up wars, we say that it's not over. We say that essentially, ladies and gentlemen, there is still too much animosity to continue on. We think that's really harmful, particularly because the Serbs are agitating to separate in this case. We think that sends a message to Serbs and other nations. Because when Christine is oh, well, other countries get along fine being non-ethnic, that's not the case in Croatia, where there are lots of other ethnicities. Hot in this room. Where there are lots of other, problems on the ground in terms of tensions. And they still see, war criminals like Anti-Kanova and don't want them to be sent to the RCC. When we send a message that the war is still going and ethnicity is that important, ladies and gentlemen, we actually prevent reconciliation in other countries with Serb minorities. We say the Republic of Serbia, necessarily still finds that important. We think that, minorities in other countries do exist, and if there are problems with the current state in terms of lack of reconciliation, you only make them worse. If there are problems in the state already, saying that reconciliation isn't possible only exacerbates the problem. We say that's harmful. We say that to give the message that conflict is over and done with, the reconciliation has been achieved to some extent, is much more powerful for those communities on the ground, those minorities who are struggling to fit in with the majority. We say that necessarily the process is going to be better under this side of our house. We beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to talk about community violence and the importance of historical propensity. Why this isn't an area where we can converge on the middle ground, where they can just agree on stuff and everything will be fine in 50 years. This is a place where peace, although there aren't outright wars, doesn't really exist for real people. That is why they choose to separate themselves from everyone else. That's what I'm talking about. Most of my remarks goes into women. First of all, two pieces of standalone to hand. First of all, in terms of ethnicities elsewhere. There are lots of ethnicities in the Balkans. There are lots of minorities. We do not think the existence of ethno-national states, ethnic nations, means that those other ethnicities are not deserving of protection, nor should be afforded it by that state. We don't think that's really an issue for our side. In terms of this idea about, well, what about Croats being able to talk to their Serbian partners and so on and so forth, we're not making them leave if they don't want to. What we're saying is that there was an overwhelming feeling within the Srpska Republic that they need to have this independence completely from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because only then can they self-direct no thank you to a degree where they feel secure. Because a massive problem within the Balkans, and this is moving on to my substantive, is this idea of mentalities of insecurity. This is precisely why, even when federalism was tried before under Yugoslavia, even when people tried to be cohesive and live along beside each other before, it ultimately failed at the fall of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Why is that? No thank you. It's because too many ethnicities felt subsumed by others around them. Not only that, but there are historical precedences where there have been laws claiming that the very existence of other ethnicities alongside you was an epistemic threat to your identity, and via that a practical threat to your own experience and ability to exert your freedom in the world. Because these are not just ethnicities that stand alone, and in other ways they're all very similar. These are people who are also divided upon religion, which they associate with their ethnicities. That, in turn, turns itself into which institutions they wish to perpetuate, how they wish to govern themselves, how they wish to want to act in everyday life, and all these other sorts of social situations, which means they cannot possibly interact with people who are so separate in their minds from themselves, and that those other people exist in a greater quantity than they do, necessarily limits their ability to access those freedoms. No thank you. When did fear of this happen in the past? Well, in Croatia, pre-Yugoslavia, they had ethnic laws claiming that Serbians were an ethnic threat to their existence. That is exactly why during World War II, some of the biggest concentration camps in Europe were ones in Croatia, where over 278,000 Serbians were killed. Yet, how many people know about in the Western world? How many people turn to them and say, these were atrocities committed against your people and we want to help you? Instead, no thank you, and understandably so, a lot of attention is given to atrocities committed between 1991 and 1995. There were also atrocities committed on the Bosnian and Croatian side, yet nobody from Croatia and nobody from Bosnia has been prosecuted by war crimes. Only the Serbian people, no thank you, has been demonized and marginalized, within this community. Meaning that when they coexist in a Bosnian state, and understandably so, Bosnian victims of atrocities want to reclaim and prioritize themselves to demand their own security and try and ensure that security for themselves. In doing so, they necessarily undermine the security of other Serbians living alongside them. Another point on this idea of marriage. There were interreligious and inter-ethnic marriages pre-1991, but not surprisingly, they massively decreased afterwards. Why is that? Because it's really difficult to marry someone who is not of the ethnic group that you personally identify as being responsible for raping, killing, and otherwise committing mass atrocities. Again, people like you immediately associate with and therefore feel that those are atrocities partially committed on you as well. This is why rape and war is committed, or is rather prosecuted differently, because it's not just a crime committed against an individual, but it's also committed against an individual as part of a group. Yeah?
If you're saying ethnic tension is such a problem, why do you want to send a message to the Balkan region you cannot interact with a person of different ethnicity?
I think you're ideologically naive to think that these people can do that. We'd love it. We really, really would. If you could have a multicultural, happy, everyone giving hugs and kisses and getting on stage in this way. But it's not going to happen. Not just because of the immediate past, but it's never really existed stably within the Balkans for over 1,500 years because of all the recurring tensions and reciprocal actions of atrocities on both sides. But we lose that nuance, and we lose that at the point where we attribute them solely to one side, which we ultimately do because of the immediacy of things that happened before. We don't think it's going to happen because these are cases of extremes. Even the mainstream parties in these countries, like Serbia, like Croatia, and like Bosnia, all hold extremist attitudes to other ethnicities. Even the Prime Minister of Serbia, and no thank you, is the person who gains massive political capital when they personally intervene and propagate the arrest of people like Albanians and Croats in Serbia, because it means that they demonstrate that they want to protect those people. Those are all the sorts of bad, that's kind of our bad thing. Okay, I want to get back to where I was on this. Right, in terms of historical complexity, it is exactly the kind of idea, and thank you, in terms of you cannot guarantee your own security unless you are isolated, unless you are apart, because of all the things they've already done. It's very difficult to convince people that they won't happen again when they happened to them only 10, 15, or indeed 40 years ago. That's still within living memory, which means that when people perceive a threat, no thank you, they're far more likely to react in a more extreme way than Serbska on an individual level. People do systematically oppress and harm people from other nations within that, from other ethnicities rather, from within that state and against each other. That is really, really harmful, because we might say, oh, well, there's no wars. There's no obvious harm in terms of states fighting each other. But there isn't peace within those communities, nor do they feel they can ever get it unless they can isolate themselves and guarantee themselves security, which they're much more likely to do at the point where they can identify themselves as a single state, because you need to respect those borders more. You need to allocate them defence budgets more. And Iran and Turkey and America are massive funders of sovereign states within the Balkans in terms of their defence budgets. The Republic of Srpska do not get that at the point where they are amalgamated into a federal state as part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that's the kind of thing, the active political intentions of the world and for themselves that they need to feel that security to prevent harming other people. And it's for all of these reasons that I beg to propose.
Madam Speaker, in extending the case in opposition, I want to talk to you about 3 points. I want to talk to you about the creation of African homogenous states, I want to talk to you about secession and stability, and I want to talk to you about how this affects politics in the region. First, we have 2 major areas of the problem. I'm just going to tackle this idea that sort of maybe came out in the first proposition, about the idea of high representation in the democratic deficit. I'd say that 2 things to that. Firstly, things aren't yet 100% stable in the region, and student secession here will only be destabilizing. They've massively overstated how much high representation interferes in everyday affairs, being that he essentially serves to protect people's rights from instability, and that will continue to take place in the instability that they propose creating. So essentially, their democratic deficit still exists, and as we said, his influence is gradually increasing. Now we're talking about this thing with flat tables, which is that compromise is just fundamentally never going to happen. We're never going to agree, not even in 50 years. If you look at this, essentially ignores the history of the Balkan states, which is one of compromise in the face of an adversarial relationship, and accommodation in the face of an adversarial relationship continues to take place. We think that often tensions are inflamed in times of crisis. Responding to those crises with a dramatic action, such as seceding from, no thank you, Bosnia and Herzegovina, only inflames those tensions, only makes it even harder for people to find the accommodations that are necessary for them to have decent lives. Fletch told you, no one in Croatia has ever been persecuted. We point to Anti Vitovna, who is a known convicted war criminal. We think it is possible that the outside world should acknowledge these things, and we see it happening all the time. And I should also ignore the fact that many nations have a history of conflict, and point towards, France and Germany, who essentially spent 150 years running back and forth across each other's borders with as much arms as they could carry during the Prussian War, World War I, and World War II. And we think they've managed to reach a point where they can be stable and they can accommodate with each other. We don't think that's going to happen for the Balkan states tomorrow. We think that it ultimately just will let the chance for 2 nations to get along, for various nations to get along. No thank you. So now I want to talk to you about African homogenous states. Bosnia and Herzegovina is the most diverse of all the Balkan states. That's why it's different from Serbia and Croatia, which Christine tried to say was the same. That's why it takes the form of government that it does. Power needs to be shared in order to protect the diversity, no thank you, of its population. They proposed the creation of a mono-ethnic Republic of Srpska. First I would say to that, it's going to be impossible. You're never going to manage to weed out every ethnic minority, no matter how much the majority of people in that state might want to. People are deeply attached to their homes and to the places that they live. They misunderstand that when they say people will just choose to live
urgently. When the opposition say that our policy will send a bad message, what they do is they privilege the value of some vague signalling function over concrete harms to real people. They privilege an inchoate narrative that they don't describe in any great detail above solving actual oppression in the real world. We find that morally repugnant. We care more about people on the ground than words. I'm going to talk about two things in sum. Firstly, will this bring about real peace? Secondly, will the state function better than the status quo? Jumping right in, peace. Because we're the team in this debate to give you specific analysis on why an independent state will work and why the current compromise can't. Why? Because of Fletcher's stuff on how the atrocities committed against Serbs are such that it's now reflected in the relations today and they now have to coexist. And that feeds into realities on the ground that aren't going to change despite these guys trying. The response we get to this sort of stuff is that, well, we see with countries like France and Germany this sort of thing is resolved. We think Serbia is a bit different, it's a bit of a false analogy. Why? Because of the unique wedding of religious and ethnic identity. Because of the fact that who you're born is tied to your religion. The Bosniaks are Muslim and Serbs are Christian, are Orthodox rather, and that's tied into what we do in ways that aren't the same in France and Germany, so that analogy just fails. Okay, in terms of the stuff about how we can't have peace now because this sends a bad message that these states just can't cooperate. Okay, well, we have good reason to believe that these tensions are not going away because of the history, because of the fact that they haven't yet, and because of stuff like that. We think that we have good reason to believe that this crop will solve stuff. We'll solve this because of all Fletcher's analysis on how, like now, the insecurity problem goes away because people feel more able to guard themselves against other states. So, to whatever extent people respond to this message and start hating each other more, which we don't really see happening, that's something we're happy to bracket against the concrete benefits that we give you, so we think that we win on that. Then, in terms of the stuff, we get an extension about peace, about how we're trying to create a mono-ethnic state so we don't get peace there. Massive mischaracterization. We're not aiming for like an ethnically homogenous state. We're just allowing it to happen. If people wish to stay, that's fine. And if they do the degree of attachment that Kate describes to the country, if they do such emotional bonds to it, then we think they'll have a degree of buy-in to the state, they'll have a degree of wanting to make it work, so we think that will be beneficial. In terms of nationalism excluding people, what they tell us an extension, like one, all nationalism does that. They don't say why ours will be worse in that regard. We think whatever state you have, that harm will apply to it. Secondly, like ours brings it closer in that regard. Ours gives something more approximate to people's identity. So even if it's just somewhat excluded, they're less excluded. If people being excluded is a harm, it's less of a harm for us. We know that. Second response, we say part of nationalism isn't just defining within yourself, but also your country allowing you security against other states. The sense that you can guard yourself against harms from those other states and band together and be safe, that's obviously a benefit that we get pretty massively, given that we reflect the insecurities and the violence by dividing along these lines. Then, in terms of how this is disputed territory, so peace can't come about through that way. I'm sorry, that's just a lie. The only thing in dispute here is the borders. Like, the territory itself that we're talking about here is within those borders and not central to this debate. No one feels that they own this land anymore. That's not an issue. Okay, second cash crunch, go for it.
So what you're saying is, listing reasons these states were necessary to extremists, establishing more of the young look out minorities and giving them arms money.
You're saying this. What vague analysis? Who is saying this to whom and what actual effect does that have in the real world? Because we told you what this prop will do on the ground, and they instead say that when people get this message, it will inflame conflict. We think they need to do a little more than that in terms of being comparative and actually rating how we're changing things. Furthermore, like we think that in terms of this message making things worse, there are also pretty bad. We think in terms of like a genocide having occurred, we don't think that this message will exacerbate the conflict too much. And when you bracket it against all the benefits we give you on making the conflict better, we think that outweighs it. Second point, will the state function better than the status quo? Because what we want to do in extension, very crucially, is that yes, there's no full-scale war, yes, people aren't being shot, but the problem is that the small things within the state reflect the things that happened not too long ago that are still within living memory for a lot of things. So when there are crimes on the street, when there's political upheaval between these ethnic groups, that harks back to that tension and reflects it and perpetuates it. So we think that for that reason these things cannot coexist, because even if there's no outright war, it's not real peace, because the peace brings that back. The response we get to this is that, well, we'll overcome that because the Balkans have a great history of cooperation. What? Okay, first response, like everything everyone else has said in the rest of this debate, would indicate that there hasn't been great cooperation, that there has been somewhat of a tension. We imagine that's why we're having this debate in an attempt to solve it. Secondly, we think that regardless of like the past history of the Balkans, we think recent history is probably more relevant in like evaluating how people are likely to act now and how this is actually going to work on the ground. We think that if you look back at the 2 decades, stuff like ethnic groups killing each other might indicate that history from like before that could be overridden by that. Okay, in terms of entrenching national identity, one thing, if they're right, why are we having national autonomy? Why are we having this degree of separation at all if having a division in any way exacerbates that? The response we get is that somehow being linked economically will lead to peace, although being linked in terms of ethnicity won't. So it's like we've got the conflict in that, the compromise in that way. We don't see why economics specifically will unite these people. We don't think that people have a separate part of their brain in which they calculate economic decisions. Rather, we think these things are interwoven with the greater like political calculus in which to make decisions. If nothing else, because the way you vote people in isn't voting in like specific economic decision makers. So we think it's tied with politics in that way. And insofar as politics are tied with ethnicity, that still happens. 2, like we think rather than entrenching it, it's pretty much an appropriate recognition of what's already there. Because more analysis on how these are things that time won't resolve, things that are perpetuated even now with every action that these people take. And Hannah agrees that this is important. What we brought to an extension was this going to change. Okay, very briefly, the scoping of an extension about how this won't function because it goes against the EU. Like the EU supported this border in the first place, we don't think they're going to mind. So, because we bring about real peace and because the state will actually function in that place.
In summing this debate, we asked 2 questions. Firstly, does this harm the Republic of Srpska both like materially and politically? And secondly, does this like inflame tensions in the region and harm the international behavior between these countries? It isn't simply a matter of whether political discourse in the Republic of Srpska is improved, but rather the discourse between states and whether that can be harmed, to which we get no responses really to the proposition besides red hair. We have one like unintegrated point of both. We're told by the extension speakers essentially that like they can never have peace because there are historical grievances. They say, like for example, that like before 1991 there were significantly greater intermarriages between ethnic groups. While while earlier saying that there were like earlier grievances created by things like genocide during World War II. So they demonstrate in their own arguments that like those things can, as time passes, be improved. In the sense that post-World War II, those marriages increase. We say that simply saying, like, in terms of it is a shorter time scale, yes, but that's the whole point. Like you're talking about a longer time scale. In terms of like seeing each other as the enemy, like we say that like the main problem like is created when you allow groups like to essentially disassociate from each other while still considering each other enemies. We don't think that you actually correct for that. All you do is remove the structures under which peace is being maintained. Let's talk about how this actually harms the people of the Republic of Srpska. This case tells you a lot of things in which we get very few responses. Because if we tell you, first of all, the economic integration within Bosnia and Herzegovina is quite great. Like we get this and stuff out of proposition, they tell us like their media is somewhat different. It doesn't change the fact that much of the infrastructure is shared and necessarily shared because they're very small countries and require that political organization together. And they both all regions split apart in this way are materially impoverished in a very real way, and we get no real response or proposition on that. Which is unfortunate. But secondly, Kate tells you that what happens is you significantly harm minority groups. We get what they proposition to misunderstand. If we tell you this on several levels, this is not just firstly, this is more than simply being like a smaller group within a country. Like say the Bosniak minority remaining within the Republic of Srpska that is weak. What you do is that it's more than just a narrative. What it is literally, materially, you are told that you are different and that your political will is so anathema to us that we cannot accept a large proportion of you within our country. Like, that isn't just a message, that is a material impoverishment of them on a political level. But furthermore, we say, and we get no response again, about the minority groups of the people of the Republic of Srpska who live within the Bosniak, majority areas. Like, these are people who the Republic of Srpska, the politicians, have a major interest in protecting, and yet you have essentially not only sold them out in the sense that you're saying that they don't matter because we'd rather have our own state and maybe come over if you want, while ignoring the historical desire to maintain it. But furthermore, you incentivize the same sort of tit-for-tat behavior by the essentially left government that is left behind. No, thank you. I think there's a major problem when you allow that ethno-nationalism to reign in this way. When you allow that to be the defining feature of the state, in that sort of meaningful way. And thirdly, we say that we necessarily empower extremism in a very, very negative way under this proposition. It's like, the Prop don't understand the nature of the sort of border claim. It's not simply just a minor dispute over the border. Like, it is a dispute over significant portions of territory within the country's control of things like cities that are ethnically diverse, in which we get no real robust proposition. But furthermore, radicals and extremists, the propositions say they are so afraid of gaining power, are the very people who do not want to see a concession made where you cannot ever get that back. Because a secession is a final act. This is what Kate tells you, and again, to which we get no response. The difference between Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the two sides can work together and live in a degree of peace, means that there is always the ability for you to live within the area that is both yours, whether it is necessarily the Republic of Srpska or the Bosniak majority area. But the problem is, when you set those concrete borders, you necessarily concede that is no longer yours at all and have no claim to it. And no moral claim to it, which is fundamentally anathema to these groups who you do empower. Because we're told a bit that essentially the politicians of these countries are forced, I'll take closing in a second, are essentially forced to pander to their nationalist bases when this happens. Really, you only feed that under this policy by this concession when you can use the radical protecting your own minorities in the other region. But furthermore, it is in practice changing. The idea that somehow the politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina are all ethnocentric at all times is simply a lie. Because they actually sort of try to slip that in there in the first proposition speech. They say in all but one election there's been single ethnic party movement. The point is that is changing and being broken down as people demand things like services. Why do they demand those things? Because there's peace. Because they're able to do so rather than being in a situation where they are constantly under threat. We think you only raise that chance. I'll take closing.
Okay. Doesn't your saying that the world to be separate isn't important enough only reinforce the idea of identity and security that perpetuates the conflict here in the first place?
There is always going to be, at least for the time being, in the wake of a recent war, some a degree of tension. The question is, how do we deal with that in the most meaningful way? The best way is to operate under a system that has consistently functioned so far to maintain peace. Is it perfect? By no means. But it is a system that has persistently allowed peace, allowed development of a greater political discourse that isn't as ethno-nationally centric as they suggest. We say that in this way, we move forward in a positive way. Secondly, how does this inflame tension in the region briefly? Because what you do is you do create a political zero-sum game. What you do is you end the politics of compromise. The beauty of Bosnia and Herzegovina is that it is a nation and country built upon the idea of sharing and compromise. It is not only a standard bearer within the region of a peaceable, multi-ethnic state, as Kate tells you, but it also shows that those oppositional narratives that exist within these countries do not need to tear people apart and can be squared, and the circle can be squared in that way. When you have that as a basis on which these countries in this region can develop, it shows that the international community is engaged in helping these countries maintain peace, maintain political order. When you remove that, when you recognize these essentially unilateral actions to secede, all you do is inflame that, all you do is undermine the international community's efforts and the efforts of the citizens and robust politicians to make efforts towards peace. We are happy to